Since Johan became the decan of onze faculteit, I've noticed a real change in the way that the faculteit has operated, and it's been a real joy to me. So we were talking just before this lecture, he and I, about the new collection we're publishing on religious radicalization, with a further collection on religious identity coming out shortly, and this lecture series on apocalyptic. And what I noticed both as an Anglicaanse priester and as a hoogleraar is that many voices around us in society say religion is dead, religion is over. But actually what I see on the ground is the opposite, is that there's a real hunger and thirst for intelligent discussion of religious themes, of ethics, of culture and metaphysics as they relate to religion. And in fact, the terrain is crowded, and each particular theological faculty has to carve out a special area for itself. And I think that Johan is helping the docenta and the studenta in our faculty to do that with such initiatives. So I'm very happy to be here. Now, what I suggest, as always, as my students here will know, I've prepared far too much material. So I'm on another screen for my lecture, and I will perhaps shorten aspects to allow us for some time for questions. I really will try to stop by 3 uur to give us some time for questions. It might go a little bit longer. And in the classroom situation, what I like is for the students to interrupt and to put their hands up and say, do you have questions, do you have questions, do you have questions? We can do that, but I think what will happen if we do that is that we won't get beyond John Locke, because there'll be so many questions. And so maybe just once, if you just let me carry on and on and on and on and see where we end up. But if you have a boiling question, there's a way of putting your hand up so that Johan can see it. And that will be helpful. Now, Johan mentioned my particular PhD thesis, which I did in the University of Strasbourg in Frankrijk. And it's an odd topic to pick, and I want to explain why I picked it, and that might help the rest of the lecture on apocalyptic. So I'm from an Anglican Christian tradition. And so deliberately, when I was selecting the subject for my doctoral thesis, I wanted to pick something which was as different from my own tradition as was possibly conceivable. And so I chose the religious history of the French Revolution, because I knew from my Anglican reading that Anglican thinkers hated the French Revolution. This is Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke was an Irish Anglican layman and political thinker, and his reflections on the revolution in France are a catalogue of fear that civilization and its norms and rights and responsibilities will be overturned and uprooted by the hyper-aggression and hyper-emotion unleashed by the Franse Revolution. So already in the 18th century, we see a very firm contrapuntal relationship between what I would say is a moderate Christian tradition like the Anglicaanse Kerk and a radical political movement like the French Revolution. And that just interests me. Everything in the, I think, Reformed and some Lutheran Christians can find the Anglican tradition extremely moderate and slow, at least in its British Isles existence. If you go to the global south, it's very different. I was born in the city of Manchester in England, and Manchester's Anglican Cathedral has a symbol, and it is, here we are, the tortoise. You see, there's no PowerPoint with me, but it's even better than PowerPoint with the props I have. Thank God for children. And the tortoise, of course, relates to Aesop's fable in the 6th century BC, the tortoise and the hare, and the tortoise wins the race. And we say in Engels, slow and steady wins the race. And the philosophy of especially 18th century Anglicanism was testudine. It was tortoise-like, slow and steady will win the race. No grave and rapid social changes. And allied to that, hence the subject of this lecture, a terror, really a terror of apocalyptic, and a great movement to undermine and destroy the intellectual basis of apocalyptic. So a quick tour of some of the thinkers concerned in that undermining of apocalyptic. I think across the whole history of the Anglican Church since it split from Rome in 1534, its greatest single thinker is John Locke. So John Locke was born in 1632, and his philosophy really was the gospel of reason, and reason conceived as tolerance and common sense, and reason conceived as indeed divine tolerance, God's tolerance. So the letter concerning toleration was written in 1689, just after 1685. And 1685, of course, in France was when Louis XIV had rescinded the Edit de Nantes of 1598, and he had taken away Protestants, the Huguenots, their religious legal identity. And that in the end produced savage persecutions of Protestants in France. It was very good news for England and for Prussia and for the Netherlands, because 100,000 rather talented Huguenots came to live as exiles in those countries. The currently rather interesting London quarter of Soho, which is not now a centre of Protestant thinking because it's the London version of the Pigalle in Paris, was actually founded by Huguenots, and it's where they organized their community in the late 17th century. And so you can see the Anglican response to what Louis XIV was doing in France was to say this intolerance, this assertion that there's one culte applicable for the whole kingdom and nothing else is even allowed to exist except Jews who are quietly ignored, will not do. It doesn't reflect a true theology. Therefore, we need to divinize the doctrine of tolerance. And that shoots its way through all of John Locke's writings. So John Locke was looking for a form of religious faith that wouldn't be morally scandalous. And of course, being an Anglican layman, he said, of course, the Church of England, the Anglican Church, represents this in a wonderful way, he alleged. And he wanted a faith which was consensual. So this might interest you as a Reformed and Lutheran audience. One of the doctrines which Locke contested and disputed in Reformed and especially Reformed theology was that of inspiration. So Jean Calvin had said, yes, but you see the inspiration of the scriptures at the point of their writing and at the point of their selection within the canon of scripture must be completed by a third stage of inspiration, which is that of the reader, that when the reader who believes opens his or her Bible, they are inspired by the Holy Spirit, and that turns the text of the Bible from being some banal document like Caesar's Gallic Wars into the very word of God, into a communication from God to us. And Locke attacked that doctrine because what he said was it was too close to superstition and apocalypticism, because it would open the way to every single Protestant Christian saying, which is actually a line of Bossuet as well in France, I am the Pope. Ik ben paus. God inspires me directly. I privately have special knowledge of what God is saying in the scriptures. And so what Locke wanted was a public, universally agreed sense of what the scriptures are saying. And so his version of logos theology was that God gives us the tools not to need a specific inspired utterance to interpret the scriptural text, but just to read off the truth from the text. Not that we say it literally or take it literally. John Locke was not a six-day creationist, but that anyone who read Genesis 1 would understand the actual words and could understand the meaning and explain it to their neighbor without appeal to a specific direct revelation from God. And so the Anglo-Saxon way of referring to this is common sense. And I think it's a very arrogant description, but if you're Anglican from birth, it sort of seeps into you that the Anglican Church is about common sense and reasonableness, and that religious apocalyptic extremes belong to other people. But there we are, that's a cultural insight rather than a true theological insight. And so just to come back to apocalypticism, Locke extremely critical of any sort of preaching that Dr. Wooston was mentioning last week about end times. He would have seen this as almost deranged, really, just not mapping onto the ways in which the general logos of God has taught us about the world. So far so good. I'm sounding like I sounded when I was a dean in Cambridge University, citing other figures like Joseph Butler, the 18th century Prince Bishop of Durham in the north of England, who was a mathematician and who introduced notions of mathematical probability into how we assess theistic claims. Again, very deliberately saying our path as Anglican Christians isn't apocalyptic. It is to say, what is the general universal knowledge we can obtain, and how do we make that, how do we spiritualize that? Or I could cite this great work, William Paley, Natural Theology. And before Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, this posthumous book by Paley, who was an Anglican priest, published in 1809, was the standard textbook for issues of religion and science in Cambridge University at the bachelor's level. And it stood, for half a century until everything had to be changed because of Darwin, another Anglican. Paley reigned supreme, and it was Paley who fed into the world, the academic world. It wasn't actually his idea originally, the notion of the watch. That if you were to see a watch on a beach, if you were, as it were, marooned on a desert island, you'd have all sorts of ideas about the watch, but you wouldn't say the watch has grown like a cabbage. It would be evident to you that the watch was constructed. There was a guiding logic and mind behind the watch because of its structure. And so it's a rather weak analogy, but he made the analogy between the watch and the universe. The universe in terms of the regularity of the laws of physics, that when I take the tortoise and drop it, it always goes every time towards the center of the planet because of the mass of the planet, and it will never go upwards, it will always go down. Here we are. That is, for Paley, evidence of the regular working of the universe, and our knowledge of God. This is an idea, in fact, that Christians got mainly from Islam, with Averroes, Ibn Rashid, the idea that we know most about God from the regularity of the universe rather than from miracles. And so even with the miracle of the resurrection, which is a spectacular miracle in which what normally doesn't happen, allegedly happens, well, that becomes a sort of regular miracle about the regularity of the universe, because Christians don't just say, oh, well, what happened on Easter Day is unique to Jesus. What happens on Easter Day for Orthodox Christians is applicable to the people of God. It is a sign of the ultimate destiny of either all or most or some or a few people, depending on your particular point of view as a Christian. But it's a sign of regularity in the universe, not of exceptionalism. And so there's an aim across these authors like Locke and Butler and Paley to see in the world evidence that apocalypticism isn't true, that appeal to and categorizing in a pejorative way weird and wonderful and exceptional and unsubstantiated claims about the future just isn't valid. And so, for example, one of the books which the 18th century Church of England found really difficult, and if you look at the statistics, there are very few sermons on it, is the Book of Revelation. And even in 2020, this is true, little factoid for you, as an Anglican priest, I know this, if ever in the lectionary, in the list of set readings, the Book of Revelation occurs, every Anglican priest is authorized to pick another reading, which is a sort of Anglican comment on the canonicity of that book, really. But that's the practical working. So I can recall when I was in Cambridge, if there was a reading from Revelation for evening prayer, when there was quite a good attendance in the chapel, I would shift it to morning prayer, when it was just me in chapel, really, because it was so early, so that the students weren't troubled by Revelation in the evening. Now, there's a sort of psychosocial process happening there, isn't there, in me as a standard English Anglican priest. And it comes, I think, from Locke and Butler and Berkeley and Paley and people like that. And just to say, just to stop it being just an Anglican love fest, that there are plenty of other non-English thinkers who think the same. A classic example would be Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, German Lutheran, luckily for me, wrote in French, not German. And Leibniz's program, I think, was even more nakedly rationalistic than Locke's or Paley's. He was a sort of Orthodox, sort of devout, sort of Lutheran, but he was adamant that in Leibniz, God is the apotheosis of reason, that a true Protestant Christianity will strip superstition entirely from Christian doctrine. And just so we're not just in the realm of Protestantism, Leibniz's direct French contemporary, François Fénelon, had rather a similar outlook. He was chaplain to the royal family, and so very well connected. And Fénelon was keen, from within an 18th century, 17th century Catholic framework, to sketch out a theory of human rights which would work within the absolute monarchy of Louis XIV. So what I'm saying here in terms of the early Enlightenment isn't just Anglo-Saxon. It's shared by, let's be frank, educated, white, bourgeois, aristocratic, thinking Christians of all Western European persuasions. And in many ways, I think that certain sectors of the Anglican Church in Europe have remained there. It's where we are comfortable. But that would be to ignore how the Enlightenment developed, because what began as a university and an educated salon culture of inquiry began, for very complex reasons I just haven't got time for now, to twist into new directions. And the example of this is the most famous person in the Enlightenment. It is, of course, Voltaire. And Voltaire, although reasonably well connected and a supreme writer, his Henriade, which is an immensely long poem written in 1723 about Henri IV, the great Protestant turned Catholic, as it were, tolerant king of France. I think the Henriade is one of the greatest poems ever written in the French language. But his popularity as a writer wasn't from great literature. It was from much shorter, snappier, populist and popular writings, which were cheap and sold well. And the two most famous ones would be in 1759, Candide. And Candide was a very short novella written as a deliberate mocking skit criticism of Leibniz's Théodicée, le meilleur des mondes possible, the best of all possible worlds, as Candide descends into ever more pain and suffering. Still, Pangloss, his advisor, is saying in the image of Leibniz, don't worry, God's law is perfect, it's all fine. And then the book I just held up is what's called for short, the portatif, the portable, the Dictionnaire philosophique of Voltaire, and published in 1764. And there, Voltaire took a leaf out of Denis Diderot's book. Diderot had published the vast encyclopédie, the Encyclopedia, from 1751 in 28 volumes. And it was Voltaire who realized this was great if you had lots of money. This was great if you had access to an academy or university library. It wasn't good if you didn't have access to such a library. And therefore, this book in a modern edition, it has 500 pages, was accessible and would make a big impact. And it made Voltaire's fortune. It's extremely critical and waspish, not so much of the Christian faith, but of the clergy. And so you're seeing it, again, there's nothing about apocalypticism here, that will come later, don't worry. But it's the way in which the Enlightenment, which begins as very, quote unquote, as we say in British English, establishment. It is actually to support the existing social order and to introduce a tortoise level and speed reform, which everyone can cope with, begins to change direction with Voltaire. Because Voltaire's criticisms of the Catholic clergy are so trenchant and cutting and witty and biting that he made the Catholic bishops of France la risée du pays, the laughing stock of the country. And you can see how in a church, in a state which only had one official church, the Roman Catholic Church, that was seen as seditious, which is why Voltaire, although French, had to live at Ferney, just on the border between Geneva and France, so he could cross over whenever things got too hot for him. And so we see the Enlightenment there changing direction. I mentioned Diderot just now. Here's a book and a film I recommend to those students who do my class on Verlichting in our faculty. This is Guillaume Niclou, his 2013 film version of his book, of Diderot's book, La Religieuse. And again, we see there that Diderot, who was well connected, who was, for example, by the end of his life, an intimate, not sexual, but an intimate friend of the Empress Catherine the Great of Russia, who was from a wealthy family and well educated. He didn't seek the end of the social order, but he realized and recognized that those who were responsible for religious teaching in his country, France, were just corrupt and were a very easy target for books that might make money. In fact, La Religieuse de Nonne was published after his death because he was too scared of censorship. But then it was a bestseller. And de Nonne deals with previously untouched subjects in French religious life. It's set in 3 convents. And in the first, Suzanne experiences religious hypocrisy. In the second, hideous religious brutality and beatings. And in the third, most controversially, lesbianism. So La Religieuse, as it was published in the early 1790s, caused a scandal because of the projection of religious women indulging in same-sex sex. And so what you see with Voltaire and Diderot is not a socially corrosive or even adventurous enlightenment, but it's highly critical. The Enlightenment passes from explaining the world and society better without alleged superstition to criticizing the powers that be, those in control, especially the church. And that's what changes its character and provides the background for the hinge, the key turning point in this lecture, which is this man, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Swiss Protestant, born in 1712. And unlike every figure I've mentioned so far in this lecture, Rousseau was not rich, was not connected. His father, indeed, was a Genevan watchmaker. Now, if you see the price of a Genevan watch, you can't buy one in Belgium now because of the lockdown these days. It costs a fortune. But in fact, to be a Genevan watchmaker, although a skilled occupation, was not considered socially elevated. And so Jean-Jacques Rousseau first trained as a musician. He wrote the articles on music in Diderot's encyclopédie. It's how they met, so they fell out later for reasons I'll come to. And then he did anything he could just to make money to survive, correcting musical scores, being a secretary for aristocrats. And his big break came in 1755 when he wrote this, called for short the Discours sur l'inégalité, the treatise on inequality. And the Académie de Dijon, I won't talk now about how the traditional universities of France, especially the Sorbonne, became seen in the 18th century as inherently conservative in the same way that Oxford and Cambridge in England were seen, and maybe still are, as extremely conservative Anglican establishments, very different from the newer generation of universities, say in London. That came later in the 19th century. What happened in France in the 18th century, in the absence of the Sorbonne could hardly bear to teach Descartes, because they preferred to teach Aristotle and Aquinas. And so the growth of académies, which were academies, independent, free-thinking, as it were, Lockean, really, Voltairean institutions began to spread. I remember when I worked for the Église réformée d'Alsace-Lorraine, there's an Académie de Metz, the Metz Academy, which is still very thriving, an existing counterpoint to what's now called the Université de Lorraine. So Dijon didn't give Rousseau first prize, they gave him second prize. Why only second prize? Because you see in Rousseau the beginnings of what I'll explain now is what we can justifiably call apocalypticism in the Enlightenment. Because the prize winner and everyone else who took part in that competition in 1755 reflected an Aristotelian view, which is that also reproduced today, may I say, in the British and American right, politically, absolutely, which is that inequality is natural and unavoidable. It is the inevitable result of scarce resources compared to limitless human demand for material goods and success. And there's no way that the resources will meet the demand. And so we need a society of state and church to regulate that, to adjudicate competing claims between citizens, and to instill in society a respect for social distinctions, which, for example, allow the aristocracy to have a greater claim on goods than the peasantry. So that was just les idées reçues, the established order. No one in the Church of England at that point either was challenging that. The bishops were all, and still are, have seats in the House of Lords, often then drew huge incomes, had large numbers of slaves in the Caribbean. They weren't after any particular deep analysis of inequality. Well, Rousseau, as it were, exploded that. And he wrote in his essay that there's a sort of two-ended apocalyptic, because the front end of the apocalyptic is that he writes a story about the beginnings of human society, which he can't prove. It's actually very similar to Lévi-Strauss, the great Belgian anthropologist, Triste Tropique, centuries later. But the story is that originally human societies were equal. The basic human position within any society originally, when we were subsistence farmers and hunter-gatherers, was to be equal and to have a mutual respect which was precious and deep. But that modern, i.e. from the Roman Empire following society, had corrupted that through hypocrisy and a desire for power, such that modern societies didn't just accept inequality, they produced inequality. They needed inequality. You can't be a rich landowning aristocrat without imposing inequality on your tenants and keeping them in their place. The system requires huge doses of inequality. And how do you stop the people revolting against it? Well, you preach inequality to them. And the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church and the Anglican Church, not that that was Rousseau's concern, were very good, all of them, at preaching inequality. And Rousseau said, no, here's the second bit of the apocalyptic, because he can't really justify historically his original claim that primitive society is equal. But what he says must happen now is we must dismantle contemporary society and its inequalities. We must start again. Il faut recommencer à nouveau. And we must rebuild society and create a new world. And you can see why he didn't win first prize, because that was attacking everyone. It was an attack on the monarchy. It was an attack on the church. It was an attack on landowners. It was an attack on all the churches at the West view of original sin, because Rousseau said original sin is a means of control, because the remedy of original sin lies one way or another in the church's remedies for it. And what if we replace that with a sort of bénédiction originelle, an original blessing, which we have corrupted as societies following that? So, I mean, everyone felt attacked by Rousseau. And the proof of that is it wasn't just the bishops of the Catholic Church in France who went for him. He had a very famous correspondence with the Archbishop of Paris. It was Voltaire and Diderot who went for him as being someone. I mean, Voltaire considered him to be a farmyard animal. You know, he might as well be walking on four legs, is what he said. Diderot, with more justification, scoffed rebuffed Rousseau for his priggishness, his sanctimonious sort of pseudo-Pasteur's approach to everyone else, someone who didn't really approve of particular divine inspiration, but yet would not answer to any other authority than his own sense of conscience, that it became unbearable listening to Rousseau's conscience every time he opened his mouth. And Diderot was right here, and it is rather shocking with modern sensibilities, with different mothers. Rousseau had 5 children, all of whom he sent to orphanages to deprive himself of the duty of caring for them. This is the same man who in 1763 wrote the bestseller Émile, all about how to educate children. Well, he didn't practice what he preached. He was a hypocrite. And that was what he was criticizing in everyone else. So Rousseau, for me, is the turning point where you have a sort of double-ended sense of beginning times, end times, apocalyptic. And it has, I think, 2 intellectual offspring. I'm conscious of time and I will rush. The first calm, gentle intellectual offspring of Rousseau is the Romantic movement. Because if you see what Rousseau's done is he's replaced the logic and the mathematics of a Locke or a Butler or a Leibniz, who were all essentially mathematicians, with feelings and emotions. And that was his version of the second generation of the Enlightenment. And that was taken up in the whole 19th century Romantic movement. And so I'm thinking of, maybe the most famous English language poet after Shakespeare is William Wordsworth, Anglican, the brother of an Anglican priest, poet laureate, the official royal poet in the 1840s. And he is famous still in England for these beautiful, uplifting, rural countryside, farmland images. I wandered lonely as a cloud. It's all daffodils and the Lake District. It's all very, very tame and unthreatening, but romantic and about feelings. And that's one of the offspring, one of the children intellectually of Rousseau. But the other child of Rousseau is something much more dramatic. It is the French Revolution. And so when Johan was saying, tell me, Jack, about apocalyptic in the Enlightenment, as I got thinking about it, where I really see apocalypticism in the Enlightenment is in the Club des Jacobins, the Jacobins of the French Revolution. I'm conscious of time. I'll do a bit on that now. So I have written extensively elsewhere on this. And I'm just rushing ahead. What I'll do with the full text of this, I'll submit it to Johan for inclusion in the Analecta next year. And if he says it's good enough, you can read the whole thing with the full footnotes. But the Club des Jacobins, the Jacobins, began life as the Club Breton, as the Brittany Club of lawyers from Brittany who met to discuss tactics when the États Généraux, the States General, met in Versailles in the summer of 1789. And the Bretons, the people from Brittany, were soon joined by a whole galaxy of future famous revolutionary names who joined the Club Breton, even though they weren't from Brittany. So Honoré de Mirabeau joined the club. Emmanuel Sieyès, who was a Catholic priest, joined the club. He was one of the authors of the Déclaration des droits de l'homme. Antoine Barnave, a Protestant, sadly famous for defending slavery, joined. Henri Grégoire, the Abbé Grégoire, who was another Catholic priest who became a bishop, joined the club. And here we are, a very strange Christmas present. Here is Maximilien Robespierre, always beautifully, smartly dressed and always in a powdered wig. He joined the club too. He was an unknown lawyer from Arras in the northeast of France. And then when in October 1789, The Paris mob went to Versailles and literally frog-marched the royal family, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, from their palace in Versailles to their palace in the Tuileries, what's now called the Musée du Louvre, in the center of Paris. All the revolutionary clubs moved from Versailles into Paris. And the Jacobins, the Jacobin club, moved to a Dominican monastery on the Rue Saint-Honoré. But the Dominicans in France, their headquarters was in the Rue Saint-Jacques in Paris. And so the Jacobin was a nickname in France for the Dominicans. And so a bit like the modern word queer, which was an original insult, which has been owned by the gay or LGBTI community as a badge of honor, the Jacobins took this pious, oh, you're Dominicans, you're the Dominican fathers of the revolution, and they used it as a sort of inverse badge of the fact that they absolutely were not the Dominican Catholic fathers of the revolution. And the two big clubs which emerged in the revolution were the Club des Jacobins, increasingly dominated by Robespierre, and the other one was the Club des Cordeliers, which is much more proletarian, but actually more moderate. And its guiding light was, thank you, Christmas present, Georges Danton. Georges Danton, originally Robespierre's friend, though later guillotined by him as part of the apocalyptic stuff I'll come to very shortly, I promise. I know that time is running out. And so the Jacobins occupied this the subscription rates for the club were quite high. And so it was a club for the aristocracy and the haute bourgeoisie. An example is the last king of France, Louis Philippe, was a member of the Club des Jacobins, as a young man, a soldier in his early 20s, which shows that it wasn't just about, red Bolsheviks. The Jacobins were educated lawyers, aristocrats, members of society with a big left-wing message. The Cordeliers were more proletariat, but actually more moderate in the ways that, looking at the English working class, they're the ones who often vote conservative. But the Club des Jacobins began to lean more and more left. And when Barnave sulked because he didn't like any criticism of slavery, because his family benefited from the slave trade, and took a huge number of Jacobins out of the club to found a new, more right-wing club called the Club des Feuillants in July 1791, that left even more space for the Jacobins to go more and more to the left. And then this is very typical of all revolutions, but they split into different tendencies. So if there's two main clubs, the Cordeliers and the Jacobins are on the left, even within the Jacobins, there are two main factions who, of course, hated each other. And the faction that this really becomes evident from September 1793, in fact, the proclamation of the Republic. The right-wing faction of the Jacobins is called the Girondins, and the left-wing faction of the Jacobins is called the Montagnards, those who are from the mountain, because in the Convention Nationale, they sat in the upper seats of the chamber on the mountain. They also sat on the left facing the Président, hence we get the term in modern political usage, left and right. The Jacobin Montagnards sat on the left. Now, again, we'll come to the apocalypticism very, very soon, but there's a seizing of power by the Montagnards, the left faction of the left club. And that happens increasingly from April 1793. When the Convention Nationale establishes an executive committee, the Comité de Salut Public, the Committee of Public Safety, which increasingly becomes, bit by bit, the voice of the Jacobin Montagnards and forms and execute policies. In June 1793, the Girondins, the right wing of the Jacobins, are expelled from the Convention Nationale, largely through mob pressure, and the Montagnard Jacobins effectively run France until Robespierre's fall a year later in July 1794, at which point the club is closed down permanently. Now, that's a very potted history, but let's look at the thought of the Jacobins, and why it's apocalyptic. The main thinker of the Jacobins wasn't Robespierre himself, he was the speaker, it was this man, Antoine Saint-Just, whose very first speech in Parliament recommended the abolition of the monarchy. And if you read Saint-Just's treatises and letters, he was a failed law student and a pornographic poet turned into a very successful soldier, who was guillotined, by the way, on the same day as Robespierre in the end. But he had a program for revolutionary France, which I hope we'll see is redolent of not just feeling, but apocalyptic. So here it is. And here's where I have to say, in all honesty, PowerPoint would be useful, because without the written text, you're all scribbling down things. But here's the program which Antoine Saint-Just has for revolutionary France. It defends liberty. It defends the motherland. The Jacobins are very patriotic. It defends the rights and equality of Black people and attacks slavery. It campaigns for the virtuous poor. It campaigns for the military and the army. Don't forget, Saint-Just was a soldier. It campaigns against the rich, the decadent, the corrupt, and the aristocracy. It advocates strict social equality. Now, how are these aims to be propagated? Well, there's advocacy in the Convention Nationale. The army will defend France's frontiers. The Jacobins will preach mutual social aid and altruism. But listen to this, Saint-Just is very keen on this. There is to be a constant diabolization, a constant making into the devil of the Republic's enemies, and a constant lionization, a constant praising of the ethical virtue of the Republican poor. This sense of elect and non-elect, of sheep and goats, is very deep in Jacobin thought indeed. And there has to be a teaching to the nation that this was a crucial period in world history, and that the whole future of the world depended on the Jacobins and the revolutions and the republic's success. So you see how we're shifting into the programmatization of what Rousseau said, but with elements which are, to my mind, actually religiously, because you can't. I mean, the division of the world into sheep and goats, it strikes me, you know, brebis and bouc, is a religious, I mean, it's a gospel idea. It doesn't come from the Enlightenment as a rational source of knowledge. It's a para-religious idea. And the idea of constant vigilance. So on many Jacobin pamphlets, again, a PowerPoint would be useful here, there's this huge, great eye, this eye blinking at the reader. And the eye represents Jacobin vigilance. You've always got to watch out for enemies. You've always got to watch out for the goats, the non-elect, who will destroy the revolution and pull down the blessed, never called a New Jerusalem, but it actually meant a New Jerusalem, which the Jacobins were trying to create. And that can be summarized, the greatest, perhaps the single 20th century historian of the French Revolution is Michel Vauvel. And Vauvel summarizes the whole Jacobin project with the following French word, jusqu'au boutisme. Jusqu'au boutisme, that is the quality of going to the very end, of stopping at nothing. You let no obstacle stand in your path. In other words, you're completely irrational. You just push and push and push. And that's how the Jacobins, although originally a small minority in the Montagnard Jacobins, a small minority in the Jacobin club, and a tiny minority in the Convention Nationale, in the end took power. They pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed until everyone else was unseated from power. Now, I'm just pushing ahead because I'm conscious of time. I want to move just very, very quickly, to how I really began to think this was apocalyptic. Bear with me. This is a 20th century historian still alive, Richard Overy. Richard Overy was, until he retired just a few years ago, Professor of Modern History at King's College London, which is the Anglican University in London of high reputation. Its rival is University College London, which is the secular university in London. And this is his most famous book, The Dictators. And Overy has a theory about what it takes to be totalitarian. And again, he's not using the word apocalypticism because he's not in any sense a religious historian, but I think it's there. And he has four qualities wherein we can say that a given regime or a given leader is totalitarian, jusqu'au boutiste, in ways which I think in the faculty of theology, we can say, we sense that this is apocalyptic, picking up some of what Dirk Wuston was saying last week. First, there's the crucial role of a great leader. So look at Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, or Robespierre's France. That Robespierre is the great leader whose personal sacrifice, whose personal self-abnegation enabled the revolution to take place, and without whom the entire project is lost. So there was a case of, it's a famous l'affaire du canif, when a girl with a penknife, tried to attack Robespierre. And this was built up into this amazing, terrible plot against Robespierre. There was a girl with a penknife, for goodness sake. And the girl was executed and her family and so forth. The sense in which the whole republic had been saved, the great leader had been spared by providence for his great work because the evil conspiration of the canif had been foiled. So this bigging up of the great leader. The second in Richard Overy's typology is the division of the world into sheep and goats. So Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, Robespierre's France depend on this. There are goodies and baddies, and the goodies are lionized and praised as being the elect, and the baddies are not really considered human. They are expendable. They can be guillotined or shot or gassed at will without any état d'âme. You just do it because they don't count. They're bad, they're evil. The third quality is, I think, highly relevant to all three, and I would say is maybe indeed part of apocalypticism. It is the easy resort to violence. The Jacobins almost gloried in violence. They saw the guillotine as le rasoir national, the national shaving razor, to be dropped again and again and again and again and again in a sort of religious expiation, the bloodletting, a sort of bouc émissaire, the scapegoat. The shedding of blood is good for the Republic, it's good for the future of France. Blood must be shed. So when the Tribunal Révolutionnaire was set up, the Revolution Tribunal, effectively by the Comité de Salut Public, it only had two possible verdicts: acquittal, and acquittal happened in about 1% of cases, or in 99% of cases, la guillotine. There's no possibility in Jacobinism for any middle moderate ground. It is all or nothing. All or nothing. Violence is not to be deprecated. Violence is to be celebrated and embraced as part of the redemption of France or Germany or Russia. And the fourth, which I think is absolutely fascinating, and where I think Overy slips into a religious typology, and it's the complex fantasies in totalitarian regimes about the future. about a kairos moment, about a crisis in history, about a future of earthly glory and peace, about the destiny of the world, about an earthly heaven for true believers. And that is absolutely inside Jacobin speeches and rhetoric, and I haven't spoken about it today, but Jacobin religion, the culte de la raison, the culte de l'être suprême, are the two attempts by the Jacobin Republic to have some form of public religion, which is civic, to replace the Catholic Church, which they thought was discredited and superstitious and monarchist and treacherous. Well, the future glory on earth of the French Republicans was part and parcel of that. And what Overy says is that's shared by other totalitarian regimes too. And so I guess my thesis is, in that sense, the Jacobin program is a program of a strangely apocalyptic version of Enlightenment thought, in which ideas about mathematics and ideas about moderation and tolerance are just jettisoned, and in which Rousseau's sense of rebuilding the world, recreating the original states, the innocence, the virtuous innocence of the peasant farmer is to be supported, is made into a national policy, and it becomes in itself a form of religious apocalypticism, with all the language around that, which Dirk was talking about last week in terms of Luther, of the end times, the crucial period in history, the dangers to true believers. It's all there. Now, I was going to talk as a coda, I won't do it now, don't worry, because it's gone 3 o'clock, about a modern version of this, which is the Khmer Rouge. And the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia is an example, I think, of, because it's highly, I mean, Cambodia was a French colony, and so it's highly influenced by French thought, the French far, far, far left, French Jacobins in the 1950s, in the Sorbonne, ideas imported into Cambodia, and which produced the particular wildly apocalyptic post-Buddhist cruelty there. But I'm going to stop there because I could go on and on and on, and my students here will know I can just go on and on for hours and hours and hours. But I want to stop myself there. There'll be a full version of this, I hope, in the Analecta, which discusses it much more fully with footnotes. But now I very happily take any questions or corrections or points that you have, and I thank you for your patience in listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Ik ben er zeker van dat er vragen zijn. Ik doe het in het Nederlands. If there are any questions, please raise your hand.
Yep.
Niemand. Ik heb wel een paar vragen. Well, Jack, I have some questions. Start with the first one.
Yeah, far away.
You were talking about Anglicanism and the slow and steady race, wins the race. Yes. The slow and the steady wins the race.
Wins the race, yeah.
And Anglicanism wasn't all that apocalyptic in your lecture.
Yeah, in my opinion, yeah.
Yeah, but I was wondering, there were some Anglicans who made who made a lot of work in apocalypticism. For instance, Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton was.
Oh yeah, it's true.
He was.
It's true.
His whole life was studying the Apocalypse of John, and he was Anglican priest.
Yeah.
Clergy. So how does he fit, or doesn't he fit? And in that same line of thought, there was some famous English poet, you didn't mention him, but William Blake, who wrote the lyrics of some poetry that is still very popular in England. Jerusalem, that's very apocalyptic.
Jerusalem, yep. Yep.
Can you?
Met plaisir. Met plaisir. You're quite right, and any lecture has to be a summary of all the available knowledge, and you are quite right. And so one of the things which really, I'm choosing my words carefully, perplexes modern scholars of Isaac Newton is that, especially towards the end of his life, he wasn't so much interested about planets and gravity as about the end of the world.
Yeah.
And his two favorite books were the Book of Daniel and the Book of Revelation. And he was an embarrassment to his fellow professors in Trinity College, Cambridge, where he lived, because he became, I think, obsessed about the idea of the end of the world and the end times and how to predict the exact time when the end of the world would happen. So that's quite right. Now, here, don't forget, Johan, I'm a sort of rationalist Anglican. So how I need to put on, as it were, my rationalist spectacles. So with my rationalist spectacles, how do I assess Isaac Newton? And it's this, and I don't actually see what I need to do, or what we need to do, is have a full doctrine of what we mean by apocalyptic. Because I would say this about Isaac Newton, and I'll come to Blake in a bit. His approach, this is a paradox, but sometimes paradoxes are true. His approach to apocalypticism was rational. Okay, so what he was trying to do was mathematically plot from the movements of the moons of Neptune and everything else when the rapture would happen. So it wasn't what he was in essence a good Anglican. He wasn't saying, I, Isaac Newton, have had a special revelation from God, and I know that in 2 years' time, the rapture will come. You must give me your money. You must have sex with me, and I will make your babies and all that. No. It was, how can we, as it were, with the logos, which is universal, and the mathematics which God has given us, how can we use the texts which are pellucid, which are not arcane, weird texts? The texts of the Bible can just be read off in terms of their meaning. How can we then predict, quote unquote, scientifically, the end of the world? And so what you see, if you like, Johan, for me, is a particular rationalist Anglican view of apocalypticism, whereby it's not, it is about the end of the world. And it's important to know that even in his time, most of his fellow Anglicans, you had to be an Anglican to be in Cambridge University until 1870. So they're all Anglicans, his fellow lecturers, and almost all clergy were very alarmed by this. They weren't in favor of this. But what people accepted was Newton isn't just being, I'm in no sense making a denominational point. I'm using the vocabulary they would have used, some sort of Anabaptist preacher who's just sort of wildly, with apologies to any Baptists here, wildly delirious in some sort of religious sorts of frenzy. It was, how do we, as mathematicians, reading the scriptures which are lucid, how do we predict the end? But there is definitely, I accept, a sense of apocalypticism. And just to finish off before you come back, you mentioned William Blake, another Anglican. Blake writes Jerusalem. Blake is socially involved. And I would see him, in terms of my typology, as in between the Romantics and the Jacobins. So Blake is a poet. Blake's a very able poet. He's a mystic. He's an artist. He draws the famous picture of Newton naked with dividing calipers, which is now as a statue, if you've got internet, is a beautiful bronze statue outside the British Library in London. That's a Blake drawing of Newton measuring the universe under God. And so there's this, all that to me is very romantic, but there is a very clear social message about the end times of political life in Blake, which I think is picking up from another group I didn't mention, the Methodists. And the Methodists are, of course, John and Charles Wesley, Anglican priests thrown out because they ordained other priests, even though they weren't bishops. And they began this movement, which was anti-slavery and on the left, quite radical in many ways, socially radical, preaching in the fields, agrarian, not violent, never violent. That's a distinction between that and the French Jacobins. But you see how the extreme distinction which I've made between the British Isles and the continent isn't valid. I accept that. There's lots of cross-fertilization between France. Every English educated person would have spoken fluent French until the 20th century. And so there was a lot of cross-fertilization of ideas. William Wilberforce first encountered a desire to abolish slavery when he was in France, visiting France as a new MP. So that cross-fertilization is there. It's just that for the purposes of my lecture, you see in the Jacobins and say the Khmer Rouge, this extreme form where it seems to me to be irrational. It's untethered from reason and rationality. It's just about feeling and being right and hoping for the end of the world. If you did believe in God, as Robespierre did, that God was your God who was defending you and opposed to your enemies. And that is not what Blake taught. It's not what Newton taught. So I guess there is, I'm trying to cling here, Johan, to a belief that the English tradition and the Anglican tradition at this point are more moderate than France. I mean, you're a scholar of these things too. So, I mean, do you accept that, or do you disagree, or what?
No, I totally agree. If there's nobody, I will ask you another question. Then maybe it's interesting to go on that topic. Yep. But this morning we had a very nice lesson about the Leviathan. Arjan talked about the big cows, monsters from the sea, the one monster from the sea. And I approve your idea that the English period is more moderate than the French Revolution, sure. And you can find that in Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan. He wrote a book. And in a way, it brings us until today, because culture today, Western culture, on a regular basis, we think we are top of everything. And it starts in that period in England with Thomas Hobbes, who said, we must provide the people with an idea that good and bad are always there. It always is a mix of good and bad in society. And that's the Leviathan. There's always things that are bigger than us. And that's one thing, the coincidentia oppositorum, the good and bad being together, fighting together. Democracy must organize that conflict. That's an English idea. That's Thomas Hobbes. So the French said, no, we must fight the other one, not organize the contradiction. You see? So I approve your thing, but I was wondering how does England, the American tradition, American Revolution was before the French. That was apocalyptic as well, doesn't it? How does that fit that scheme?
Thanks, Johan. These are very good questions. See, what I would say in my snobby way is that Hobbes wasn't really an Anglican.
No.
So but he learned his ideas in France when he visited France as a young man, and he wrote under the Cromwellian Republic. And that if you look at the Restoration, Kerk van Engeland from 1660, they spent a lot of time and energy repudiating Hobbes. If you look at, and moving from the Anglicans, but look at Leibniz. I mean, Leibniz spent his entire adult life writing against Hobbes, because it's a salient idea, I think, for the American and French revolutions, because Leibniz said the following. If, like Hobbes, you agree that the essential factor in human relations is power, is might, is force, then excuse my language, but we're all screwed. We're all screwed, because might is right will prevail and the weak will be crushed. And so what Leibniz was saying is, no, in spite of appearances, the essential factor in human relations is reason, the reason that comes from God, and therefore we can look beyond power structures, we can look beyond the brute use of tyrannical force to something which is more reasoned. I think I'm right in saying, I would have to check, either the Jacobins or the Cordeliers had a bust of Thomas Hobbes in their meeting hall, maybe even both. They had Brutus and then Marat when he was killed and what have you. I think Hobbes featured. And so Hobbes, to my mind, not a proper Anglican, a Republican Anglican when Anglicans weren't Republicans, fed into this French tradition, which legitimized what I say. Hobbes legitimizes violence in the end. To me, he legitimizes violence in ways that I'm thinking of an immediate counter argument. Hobbes will say that he was honest. And Locke, in fact, also legitimized violence. He just disguised it better, because anything to keep the Ancien Régime propped up was legitimate for Locke, whereas Hobbes was more honest about human relations and how the power dynamics of human relations. But where I think the British and French traditions diverge is, I guess, it's this Richard Overy role of violence. That with the French Jacobins, there was a real embracing of violence. And to come to the Americans, it's not something I know an awful lot about. Though again, Thomas Paine is an important ingredient there who isn't Anglican. I would see the American Revolution as fought by non-Anglicans, because I'm ashamed to say almost all the Anglicans in the 13 colonies were in the southern slave-owning colonies, named after British monarchs, like Virginia, named after Elizabeth the Virgin Queen, or Carolina, named after Charles I, or Georgia, named after George I. That's where the Anglicans were, and they were the least revolutionary of the American colonists, who tended to be Presbyterians and Reformed and Congregationalists in New England. But again, what I would see there, picking up the big line of Simon Schama in his book Citizens about the French Revolution, is the American Revolution did not indulge and handle violence in the same way that the French Revolution did. It was violent. It fought a war. It fought a war of independence and said it was justified in fighting the war and in committing the odd atrocity of war. But it did not have, to my knowledge, though I'm willing to be corrected, the same sense. It was apocalyptic, absolutely. It was a huge amount of Christian Protestant apocalyptic imagery and literature was fed into it, and we see that today in Pennsylvania with all sorts of people on both sides contesting or supporting the recent election. Thank God for Biden. But I don't see this Jacobin sense of absolutism, of jusqu'au boutism. And I would say, in fact, looking at what's happened in the past month, that the American Constitution is constructed to stop that. Yeah. It gives the states enormous rights against the central government. Washington, D.C. has surprisingly few rights compared to the states' rights. It's being framed in ways which do continue to stroke white people in the South, the ex-slave owners, and give them more of a say, perhaps, than they would demographically have. And that might or might not be, I think it is a problem. But I would then see with Simon Schama a cleavage between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. But I'd be willing to be shot down on that because I don't really know about that. Yeah. Fascinating, fascinating. I'm flattered that our faculty has engaged with these issues. Yeah.
Well, just a short answer, Jack. If you let me ask you one thing, would you agree when I say that liberal democracy is a secular apocalypse?
It's a brilliant essay for an exam,
No,
isn't it?
What do you think? Would you agree when I say this?
I think what I've learnt in writing, what I've learnt in writing this lecture, and today in talking especially with you, is I think we're going to need more work on defining what we mean by apocalypse and apocalyptic. Because it becomes to me a bit like the word grace, or heaven, or good works, or, God forbid, justification.
Yeah, well,
it's a sort of coat hanger.
It's just the idea
on which we can hang all sorts of stuff. Yeah.
It's
the
idea of the end of history, and the end of history.
Yeah.
Like there's some books.
But you see, don't you think, Johan, that my sense of how Anglo-Saxon liberal democracy works is that, apart from Francis Fukuyama, it's not conceived as the end of history. It's just this ongoing Platonic state of political bliss in which democratic liberalism will reign supreme. And I think that's its chief mistake. Maybe in our terms, it should be more apocalyptic, because I think people in Britain and America have got bored with that. They even, God help us, prefer a demagogue, ignoramus like Trump, because he's not just saying all the battles have been won, we carry on together as one great sisterhood and brotherhood in this long line of peace and prosperity for all. What's interesting about human nature, and where the Jacobins and the Khmer Rouge tap into something quite deep, and why in modern British religious life the Anglican Church is struggling, because people find it boring. And certain people are looking for something much more sexy, much more exciting, much more risky. And you can see how, although I certainly don't approve, the French Jacobins tapped into that to the extent that even aristocrats and a future king joined in. Yeah. Interesting, very interesting. Yeah.
Okay, please, somebody, a next question or something. Otherwise,
anything else? Yes, I don't know. I just.
We can go on all evening, Jack?
I think we could go on, but
yeah, Chris, I tried to unmute.
How do you explain the hatred in French Revolution against the church? Because you explained the goodies and the baddies, but the church could as well be on the side of the goodies. How does it come that the French Revolution put the church on the baddies?
Yeah. Thank you. I think all the questions so far have been really good, and I could talk for a very long time about that question. It's really interesting. What I read in the 18th century French Catholic Church, the Église gallicane, is that there are two main tendencies. And the first tendency is to giggle along with Voltaire. It is to be aristocratic, to sneer at the poor, to be, if you're a young nobleman, to want to be an archbishop before you're 35, to have the land and the property, to spend your year at the court in Versailles with the royal family, studiously to ignore the people. And a great example of that, of course, is Talleyrand, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, later on one of the great revolutionaries. He began life as a Catholic priest and a Catholic bishop, the Bishop of Autun. And until the revolution, he visited his own diocese 0 times. 0 times. So he was elected bishop, appointed bishop, without ever going to Autun. When, as part of the Fête de la Fédération, he had to say Mass in 1790, he had to consult his chaplains about how to say Mass. He never said it. Okay, he'd never actually celebrated as a bishop the Eucharist. Okay, so and was proud of it, you know, because he knew that his posh intellectual friends would say, "Oh yes, aren't you? You're a real card, you know, no superstitious nonsense for you." So that's one aspect of the Gallican Church, and the other aspect, to me, is this rigorist, moralizing, anti-Protestant, not of course Jansenists, because they were the enemies, but really quite moralizing, diligent aspect, which is, I think, those two aspects of the French Gallican Church interplay. But what I think is really missing, really crucially missing, is engagement with social work relating to the people. So if you preach sermons at them, or you're too busy in the court at Versailles to talk to them, that's not going to work. What was needed was something which is much more diaconal, was much more of the people, was much more involved in education and hospice and hospital. That was occurring, but it certainly wasn't the priority, except for a very small number of bishops, indeed. And most of them were simply not interested in that across the 106 dioceses. So in that context, it becomes very easy to write books like the Dictionnaire philosophique, which make criticism after criticism after criticism of the Eucharist, of clerical celibacy, of monks and nuns, of the religious life, of the persecution of Protestants and so forth. And the Catholic Church is this enormous target, because what, as it were, in Anglican terms, they needed was a Methodist movement to come up and say, we are with the people, we are of the people, we are relating to the people, we are with the people when they're born and when they're married and when they die. We feed them, we nurse them, we educate them, we teach them how to read and write, we send them up in the world, we send them on to university and so forth. That, to my mind, across the generality of the Gallican Church in the 18th century is largely absent. And because one of the questions which, following on, Chris, from your question, is it was really astonishingly easy in 1793 for the Jacobin Republic to abolish the Catholic Church. You know, it was the religion of the majority of the French. Okay, it was split into two factions, those who signed the Constitution Civile du Clergé in 1790 and those who remained loyal to Pius VI and were called réfractaires. But when the church began to be closed, I mean, a quarter of the French Catholic churches were closed by Christmas 1793, a whole quarter. And that was just the beginning of the de-Christianisation process. There was surprisingly little resistance, you know. I mean, fast forward to 1801, when Pius VII signs the Concordat with Napoleon, in which the Belgian churches still richly benefit. Thank you, Napoleon, for all that lovely money, which the Anglicans get as well as you. The reason Pius VII signed an agreement which in effect gave complete control of the temporel of the French Catholic Church to the emperor was that he had no choice. It was either that or nothing, either that or no Catholic Church. And so he had no choice. And so he accepted, in essence, Talleyrand and Napoleon's terms for the Concordat, just to let the Catholics back in through the door, because there wasn't an overwhelming sense, except really in Napoleon's breast, of this being a pressing need. I'm abbreviating and summarizing, there's other things to say, but I think that my quick answer to your question is that the Catholic Church had concentrated on power games and on moralism rather than on pastoral engagement with the people, and that left it surprisingly short of support, except in two regions, Brittany and the Vendée. So across all the debates across the revolution, two regions remained fiercely loyal to Rome and to the réfractaire Église, and that was Brittany and the Vendée. But that resistance just fed into the Jacobin doctrine of sheep and goats. that people in the Vendée and people in the Brittany were enemies of the Republic, in the pay of a foreign prince, the Bishop of Rome. They needed to be wiped out. And of course, huge cruelties took place there. Now, if you ask me, why is it there was huge loyalty in Brittany, but not in Lorraine to the Catholic Church, I just don't have the local answer to that. That there must be an answer to that. Why? What is it about French Catholic history that makes two areas in particular highly resistant to déchristianisation? But that is for, I think, the anthropologists of history to look at what was happening locally. But thanks for your question. Yeah, interesting. Don't you think, Johan, that discussing these matters is like dropping a stone into a pond?
Hello.
And you look at all the ripples that come out. It's just so interesting. You know, we've had a whole tour of the Enlightenment today. It's fascinating. And it's not even 4 o'clock.
No, but it doesn't have to be 4 o'clock to be interesting. Okay, is there somebody else who wants to ask a question? Enzo?
I have a more general question. And I want to ask you, what was first, apocalypticism or politics?
Yeah. See, I think that's a very interesting question, indeed, because behind it, I see the following mental debates. Did the politics just use the apocalyptic language, or was there a genuine para-religious apocalyptic movement which influenced the politics? My sense with the French Revolution, if I'm honest, though I can't prove it, which is itself quite Rousseauan, is that the politics dressed itself in apocalyptic clothes. That they were useful, the vocabulary was useful. I didn't talk about the Khmer Rouge, but if I had, what was intriguing about the Khmer Rouge is the way they employed Buddhist vocabulary, because Cambodia is a majority Theravada Buddhist country. And the Khmer Rouge would close down Buddhist vihara and temples. But actually their language to the people was one of internal struggle, of rebirth of the nation, of the rebirth of individuals, of moving to a higher level of consciousness. They were deliberately employing and deploying a religious vocabulary, even as they closed down the temples. And my reading of Robespierre and Saint-Just is that their principal driving motivation is the political future of France. And to get there, they are willing to do anything, including to adopt apocalyptic use of language and an apocalyptic approach to human life, which is, end it's expendable. But I'm sure that there'll be another view from another scholar. I think it's a fascinating question, and it leads to a wider question, which is, to pick an obvious current example, which I hope will be uncontroversial in this meeting, Donald Trump deploys lots of evangelical Protestant Christian imagery. I have to say, I don't know for sure, but my sense is it's completely insincere. It's simply used and deployed in the service of a particular tyrannical approach to government. Mm-hmm. But I guess there are some American Christians who say, no. He is a true believer, and his political quest is part of that. I don't know.
Or they think that
yes, and so, yeah.
They maybe think that it is a facilitator, like an instrument. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, Orthodox Jews, they see Trump as a facilitator for their Zionism agenda, for the Zionist agenda.
Yeah.
So the dictators, are they facilitators, or are they just like bad guys, like baddies? So you can look at it for many.
It's intriguing. I mean, but the only piece of evidence I have is about our poor little Maximilien Robespierre, who was devoted to what he called the culte de l'être suprême, this religion of the supreme being. And a widely shared view in July 1794 is that it did cost him his head, is that his determination to get metaphysics and apocalyptic and prayer introduced even as the Catholic Church was abolished into France just irritated the hell out of most of the Convention Nationale, and they pushed him aside. You know, they got rid of him. Because when Robespierre goes, there's no more mention of the être suprême, really, not for a while. Yeah. So in that sense, yes, apocalyptic facilitated his political program, but he might all the same have been devoted to it anyway. You know, I think that if Robespierre and Saint-Just had renounced the supreme being and agreed to leave the Comité de Salut Public, they wouldn't have been guillotined. They could have gone quietly into retirement. But they were adamant that only their way and their vision of France was true and reliable. And they, in that sense, they were martyrs. They died for it. But it's the chicken and egg situation. Forget the tortoise and the hare. Which come first? In my own breast, which comes first? My religious sensibility or other factors? I mean, they mold together. You know. I mean, for example, I've never ever called myself ever a fan of apocalyptic, but I think that Johan could do an analysis of me within 5 minutes, and he could take and suck the apocalyptic out of me. Well,
no,
for example, I believe in heaven. Yeah.
But I want to just contribute a little bit more on that question, because anthropologically, politics is the most elementary form of religion. It was Emile Durkheim said the tribe or the people, they symbolize themselves in their cult, in their totem. So politics is the most elementary form of religion. So they always mix together, always. Not only Trump, all the others as well. You can't.
Johan, that's exactly what Levi-Strauss says. The totem is in itself, in terms of how it categorizes the experience of the tribe, it is identically a religious object, a social object, and a political object. And so if with Enzo and Jacques you say, oh, there's a distinction, you're playing this John Locke Enlightenment university game of categorizing and separating things which actually belong together. I get that. Interesting.
So a revolution is just oh, sorry, I'm sorry. No. Just let it. Hoe zeg je nou weer?
Good.
You can talk Dutch. You can speak Nederlands.
Nederlands is goed.
Revolution is just a ritual.
Yeah. That's a very good title for a book, and I think it's true. Yeah, there is. Earlier, I drew parallels between France and Germany and Russia and Cambodia, and any anthropologist could look at the 4 different centuries and countries and people involved and see common patterns of ritual. That to me is what could be more ritually, religiously intrinsic than a public execution. We're in the territory of René Girard and the bouc émissaire, the scapegoats. The guillotine is, think of, I wrote an article in the Analecta a few years ago about Albert Camus' criticism of the guillotine in 1958. And he makes that point exactly, Enzo, that the guillotine is a huge national French ritual in which the French people expiate the crimes committed by the murderer with blood. And it's this great ritual which could be set in the book of Leviticus, but in fact it's happening in a courtyard in Paris in the 1930s, 40s and 50s. You know, the ritual of all history is, think of the Anglican and Catholic and Orthodox criticism of Calvinism, that Calvinism pretends to abolish or to reduce ritual, but in fact it's simply replacing the High Mass with different forms of ritual which are equally ritualistic. Again, I'm not making a point against the Reformed tradition I love. It's just that, yeah, I think it's an escape. What we're doing now, of course, as we know, is a distinct ritual. A lecture by Zoom involves a ritual, really. Yeah, hey ho, all good. Good. Thank you. Johan, what is the next title in this series on apocalyptic? I've got really interested in it now.
I got to switch over again, Jack. I was totally, I'm looking. I don't know. The next one is Leendert-Jan, ik kijk naar jou. Dries van Montfort komt niet.
Ah ja, is hier. Ja. Leendert-Jan is hier.
Dries komt de tweede. Dries van Montfort komt het volgende semester.
She comes next.
Ja, ah ja, oké.
Over ecologische, de ecologische invalshoek doet zij na in april komt ze.
Next one is dan waarschijnlijk, en ik kijk naar Arjan of hij nog is, ja, is Herbert Tichelaar, hè?
Ja. Herbert Tichelaar op 9 december.
9 december, on Qumran.
Over Qumran en de apokalyptiek, ja.
Ja. Tichelaar is van de KU Leuven.
Prima.
Ja.
Okay. Yeah, I know him well. Ja. Goed dan.
Voilà. Can I...
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for listening. It's been much longer than I thought. And again, in one way or another, a full text will reach you. And many special thanks to Johan for organizing this as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Jack McDonald. Thank you very much. And we'll see you soon. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye.